welcome to everyone. My name is Silke Mischke, and I'm the co-director of IMD's Executive Coaching Certification Program. I'm also a lecturer of leadership, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Philip Holder, who is the author of the book that possibly many of you have read by now, Discover Your Emotional Intelligence. And for myself, coaching executives, I truly enjoyed reading Phil's book because on one hand, it addresses the challenges which I think many senior executives and managers face these days, meaning including emotions effectively and in their workplace. And it also gives at the same time very pragmatic, tangible advice on how you can work on these skills and sort of make them part of their daily routine, make them part of your leadership. And it was a book that I enjoyed reading so much because on one hand, I actually read it twice, because on one hand, it is very pragmatic. I felt it was a little bit like a leadership compass for developing your emotional skills. But it was also a little bit like a novel, a storybook, because Philip very generously shared those stories, those anecdotes that made him write this book, and that makes it so vivid. And I think it makes it so enjoyable to actually read through the book. And you will see, or have seen if you read the book already, that you start with an assessment of 14 emotional key skills. And then Phil makes the link between these skills and how they translate into concrete, tangible, observable leadership behavior, such as influencing others, your communication skills, how you connect with people. So all of these topics are extremely important in today's world. Now, I would like to hand over to Phil and ask the first question. I mean, starting and writing a book like this is certainly based on your tremendous experience working with managers across the globe. So was there any specific moment where you said, well, I need to get this book out? And if so, what was it?
Oh, well, hello everybody, and thank you for the questions, and certainly Silke, thank you for the introduction. It was lovely, and actually I feel as though I want to go and buy my book, which is bizarre, really. But thank you. You've done it proud. So the truth is that I was delivering a lot of programs globally that were based around the concept of impact and presence. And impact and presence was really about making sure that our emotions and the way that we manage and the way that we communicate is in line. And so I was delivering these programs across the globe. They worked really well, and two things happened. The first one was that my father, God bless him, became very, very ill. He had a major stroke, and that changed the life of our whole family as to how we were working. He was in hospital for 6 months before he passed away, and he passed just at the beginning of the pandemic when it hit the UK, and we were just about to enter into lockdown. So not only had I lost my best friend, but I'd also lost my mentor. I've lost my way of communicating with the world, which was going out and running workshops internationally, and particularly around the subjects that I love, which are around emotional intelligence and being the best that we can be. And I really sat down and thought, well, what can I do? Because I may not work for the next 6, 7 months. Who knows? It could be a year. So I started writing, and I'm very fortunate. I had a communication that was outstanding with Pearson's Publishing. They had contacted me 4 or 5 years ago and said, "Hey, why don't you do some writing for us?" And I just picked up that conversation, really. So there wasn't any major thing that I thought I have to go and write the book. It was really a case of I didn't have anything to do. That's truthful. I was at a point in my life where there was quite a dynamic emotional change for me because of my father passing. And I thought, well, why don't I just put all this stuff together and actually create the book? And I've got to say, it was a lot harder than I ever imagined it would be. because the my perspective of how things are when you're running workshops with people and you're running, you're face to face with people is one concept, but actually putting it into words is something also very different. So I'm very pleased to hear your feedback, Silke, that you enjoyed reading it and you got something out of it.
Yeah, I think, first of all, kind of going in the direction of assessing yourselves when it comes to emotional intelligence and emotional skills is not an easy thing for many managers to do, because it also involves a certain amount of vulnerability. Now, I think the way you present it, it's like, first of all, there might be different levels of development for any of these skills. And then you give very pragmatic advice. So you make it actually achievable to improve on any of these skills. And I think the exercises you present in the book, I mean, how did you come up with these exercises? Is it the work you do with the executives? I mean, how did you imagine? Because there are quite a lot of exercises, useful exercises, managers can actually put in place in their personal and professional context.
Yeah, I think the exercises really came out of running physical workshops. So a lot of those, the communication with the reader was very much based on physical experience that I've had working with very large groups of people. So those exercises are pretty much, bread and butter, or had been bread and butter for me for many, many years, because I've always tried to find new ways to bring a message home so that people can walk the talk and begin to understand what it means to them. And the only way to do that is to experience it. So a lot of those exercises have been created over 20 years plus.
Yeah, and I mean, theoretically, it could have been any book that you write during that period, given the situation you explained, but you wrote a book about discover your emotional intelligence. And I think it is something that many of you possibly follow up upon, because there was also an article from Harvard Business Review earlier this year mentioning that actually emotional intelligence is far more important than anything we can achieve through artificial intelligence. So this is quite a strong statement, and what will kind of enhance the effectiveness of the leader is being good and working with their emotions. So what is it for you that you say it is this topic on which I want to write a book?
Well, I've been a behavioral scientist for a very long time. I studied behavioral science. I worked with it. I worked with how people can get the very best out of themselves and out of their teams. And so the subject of emotional intelligence for me is something which has always been in the background. It's always been about how you can connect with people more effectively. So sort of in answer to your question, I think that the more that we can connect with our emotions and the less that we have to engage with the other parts of our brain, the more we can be present in terms of the relationships that we have. So I'll give you an example. If let's just say that there is a manager, the manager is highly intelligent, highly capable, has a massive IQ, intellectual quotient, is able to do their job to the nth degree. They may not have high enough emotional intelligence. That particular manager will become very isolated. They'll become what I would class as a silo manager. They'll be working independently. They'll be producing amazing results because of the level of their capability and their intelligence. But it wouldn't be inclusive. It would be almost exclusive to everybody else. And the problem with that is that if people, and there are many of those people around, and don't get me wrong, it's not right or wrong to not have emotional intelligence or not to use it. By the way, we all have emotional intelligence. The thing is, though, is that if that person has to manage other people or engage with other people, that manager is going to be inhibited because they won't be able to have the rich conversation with people in order to help them grow and develop. So I think the need for emotional intelligence in management and leadership is extensive. We all need it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, I mean, there are multiple, I would say, examples also possibly known to you, the audience, that illustrate how powerful leadership can be if you combine both emotional and rational intelligence. And many of you might recall the event when the pilot Sullenberger was landing that plane on the Hudson River, right? And you possibly also remember that he was questioned about his decision to land that plane on the Hudson River. So you wonder, what has this to do with emotional intelligence? It has a lot to do with emotional intelligence, because they were running these flight simulators 68 times, and they said, you have time to fly back to LaGuardia Airport. And then he said, well, listen, can we just run all these flight simulators again? And you give me 10 seconds between the moment the incident occurred and I made my call of either landing on the river or flying back. And guess what? None of the flight simulators stood 10 seconds. So I don't know if there are any pilots in the audience, but there are certainly some engineers, I would guess. I think that's a fair assumption. And you might understand that the number of sort of aspects and elements you have to consider to make the right decision in that moment, if you would use your rational intelligence, it would not be 10 seconds, right? So there's something, he followed most likely his intuition, his emotional brain, which puts information in context. So there you see how powerful this brain is. And even just from a sort of scientific perspective, your emotional brain has a capacity that's about 10 times higher than your rational brain, meaning in terms of storage. And that's why these kind of examples like the Sullenberger one are possible, because you put information in context. Now, having said that, I mean, kind of your experience, Phil, what are some of the main struggles that you observe working with managers when it comes to including emotions?
I think one of the biggest struggles is becoming vulnerable, because as soon as we start to include our emotions in our decision-making process, a lot of managers believe that that makes them vulnerable. Makes them vulnerable to attack, makes them vulnerable from criticism, from a whole range of things that people are not necessarily comfortable with. I think on the reverse side of that, one of the biggest aspects of being an emotional leader is that you become vulnerable. Because the more vulnerable you become, the more you end up being in tune with what's actually going on. The sense of the people, if you like, as opposed to just the sense which is sitting in your own head. So I think in answer to your question, one of the biggest issues is people accepting that vulnerability and allowing that to happen.
Yeah, and it's great that you address the topic of vulnerability, because I think it really is possibly one of the toughest challenges also managers in executive space, because on one hand, it allows you to connect with yourself and ultimately connect with others, which is important in the leadership role. But to some extent, it might also expose you in a way which is not helping your leadership. So we have a question here. So this was a question, Christine, you just saw a question on the chat.
Yes. Does the book distinguish between different ways of solving problems based on emotional intelligence?
Did you hear the question, Phil?
Yeah. Does the book distinguish? I would say probably not. What the book will do is enable you as a manager to be able to make the right decision based on the level of your emotional intelligence. The book isn't about this is how you make a decision. The book is about this is how you can change how you would make the decision. But I think that probably the easiest way is when we think about intellectual intelligence, we're looking at the what needs to get done, what happens if. When we look at emotional intelligence, it's about how we get things done, how we can get something done differently or more effectively. And so the making a decision is really based on your experience, your knowledge, your capability, your skill level, the situation you're in. And if it involves people, if it involves relationships, if it involves other things, then the level of your emotional intelligence will enable you to address those things better or not. And that depends on how you navigate that situation.
And it's great. Yeah, thank you very much. And it's great that you bring in the decision making, because this was about 2 years ago. I did a little research project and I asked 160 executives various questions. And among these questions were, do you include emotions in your decision making process? And so there was a scale kind of from 1 to 5, 5 being all the time. And actually only 7% included them all the time. And it was 70% which were below average. So like kind of randomly including them. Now, why I'm saying this, the same audience of 160 executives, when they were asked another question about what kind of emotions do you observe and notice at the workplace? There was a huge list. So it's like you're saying you observe all of this, but you don't take it into account. So there's a huge potential of actually learning how to do it effectively. So what do you think they might be scared of in not doing it?
I think that links back into the vulnerability. I think that links into the fear of rejection, fear of people responding in a way that isn't what they need. It may be because they think, oh, if we don't go down the emotional route, we can keep on track, and it's, if it's in business, it's down to profits, it's down to making more money. So let's just keep focused on that. The trouble is that when you don't include the emotions, you end up actually not achieving very much, because people become very isolated again. Yeah, I can't really answer the question any more than that, I guess, at this time.
Well, I mean, it's also linked potentially to the sort of earlier discussion around vulnerability. And I'm also thinking of an anecdote that you share in your book, where you said your Aikido sensei told you, stop doing, start being. And that resonated with me very strongly, because if you take the word executive, it literally means that you execute. So you do, right? So even the word as such signals this is your job, this is your mission. So would you have any piece of advice? I mean, knowing that on one hand they're expected to execute, to do and handle things, which will allow them to connect with the being.
Yeah, I think the just to reference the points in the book, my sensei, when I was doing Aikido, I used to struggle a lot with the physical movements of Aikido, because I just didn't get it. I knew that if you put some pressure in some way and you did something, then something else happened, but I just didn't get it. And I was always struggling with particular movements. And my sensei, Dennis, said to me, why don't you stop doing the movement? Why don't you start becoming the movement? Stop doing, start being. And as soon as that clicked in my brain, so in other words, rather than trying to think about the physical shape of the movement itself, I connected with the other person. So the person I was working with, the person I was practicing with, I connected with them. I read their intention. I was understanding where their movement was going, and I became the movement, as opposed to, actually the intimate part of it. I became the whole, and that whole being then started me thinking about, well, actually, we're all doing that. We're all doing the doing. We're all doing the management job. We're all doing, the driving. We're all doing those things. Whatever our function is, we're doing it. But when we become it, that's when our awareness opens way, way, way bigger than it possibly can be. I mean, I use an example again in the book where when most of us, I'm guessing most people drive and can drive a car. When you're driving a car, you're doing the functionality of the car. And when you first learn to drive, it's all about, mirror, accelerator, brakes, mirror, it's all of the processes that you have to go through to learn how to do it. I've been driving 30 odd years. I do not think about driving my car. I don't. I am being when I'm in my car. When I'm driving my car, I'm thinking about other things. And I'm not thinking about, I must turn the wheel X number of degrees to the left or to the right, or I must slow down here. It just becomes a natural thing. And I think that leadership is very much like that. And being an executive, not just leadership, but I think, executives, it should be something we do on autopilot. It's not something that we should have to think about. If you're having to think about it, then you're doing the doing and you're not being the being.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I mean, when you started, you actually allowed yourself to be extremely vulnerable. I didn't get it in the beginning, I mean, how easy is that for any of us to sometimes say, I didn't get it in the beginning. So we possibly have to go through a state of vulnerability in order to learn. So now we have a few questions here. So how can one respond so this is from Anna, if one in a business decision-making context hears the statement, don't be emotional, it's not personal.
Oh, that's a good one. Don't be emotional, it's not personal. Of course it's personal. If somebody's having an attack, if someone is having a go at you, or somebody's pointing out your problems or issues, or saying this piece of work isn't good enough, that's personal. And actually, how you deal with that is about your level of emotional intelligence. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about your immediate response, which is, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. That's, a whole outburst of your emotions. What we're talking about, emotional intelligence, is being able to say, yeah, okay, that wasn't my greatest piece of work. And one of the cool things about being highly emotionally intelligent is realizing that we all make mistakes. And that when we do make mistakes, actually, that's how we learn. So if we can turn around and say, actually, I agree with you, it wasn't my best piece of work. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to try much harder. And just taking all that negative energy away, that's the emotionally intelligent thing to do. But going into an emotional state that isn't great is not really what we're talking about here.
Yes, and it's only building up. So we have another question from John, and John, you are also getting a free coaching moment here because the question started, it sounds logical, but. So just in terms of phrasing, it's always helpful to say, it sounds logical, and on the other hand, we have agile, lean, total quality management, not to mention coding and AI applications. How does one combine both EI and rational intelligence, excellent question, in the decision-making or even broader, his management style? Very good question.
Okay, can you just run me that question again? Because I only picked up part of it.
Yeah, so basically I think, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, I think on one hand, there are a lot of processes which we have to follow in corporate, which are about all the processes like agile, lean, quality management, and then all the new applications that come in. And then how does one as a manager or as a leader combine in this context, which seems to be dominated by even more rational and process-oriented stuff? How do we combine effectively emotional and rational intelligence when we make our decisions?
Okay, bit of a big question. I think that the issue is that you need both. In order for an organization to function and become an agile business, you need to have emotional intelligence as much as you do the other stuff. And the reason being is because nothing can be done in isolation. You know, the whole process of agile is that everything works because the other things work. If you only focus on one area in agile, that's not being agile. The idea is that we keep it light. And one of the key things about being emotionally intelligent is that whole lightness. It's the way that we engage with the problem or the situation or the person or whatever it is. It's about that lightness. And you probably can't see it, but you won't see it. But on my ring, I have a feather. In my logo on my website, I have a feather. The whole idea of the feather is because the only way you can catch a feather is by being light. And that whole concept is about lightness of touch. You know, leadership is about lightness of touch. It's not about force. It's not about anger. It's not about drive. It's not about pushing. It's about allowing, enabling rather than disabling. So the concept of emotional intelligence across all areas of business, irrespective of what type of business it is about enabling and allowing and that lightness of touch, as opposed to, you know, trying to force things in the wrong way. And again, that links back into, you know, the concepts of agile leadership, agile manufacturing, agile processes, etc.
Yeah, and if I may add to this, I think for me, emotional intelligence is also about connecting the dots, because you have all these processes, you have all these things going on, and it is actually your emotional intelligence to see the bigger picture and put things in context. So my initial background was in investment banking, and you get an investment sheet and there's not much information. It takes you maybe 5 minutes to sort of skim it through, and then you say, that doesn't look good. And then you spend the next 3 days. And then after 3 days, oh, poo, that's real crap. Now I can tell why. But there is something in those first 5 minutes where you already connect the dots. And that's where the power of emotional intelligence is. And I think it's great, John, that you also manage AI, because this is one of the things maybe I want to write my next article, because in psychology, we don't fully understand neither rational intelligence nor emotional intelligence. So how potentially, that's kind of a daring question, but how potentially can we pretend we create an artificial intelligence if we don't fully understand the one we are trying to reproduce? It's just a thought out there. So we have another question. So that's wonderful. So I think this is referring back to you driving in the car, Phil. However, if you drive in auto mode, increasing efficiency isn't there.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear that again, Silke.
So this is a question from Jellison, who says, however, so referring, I think, to your car episode earlier, however, if you drive in auto mode, increasing efficiency isn't there.
I would disagree with that. And I would disagree with that because if the more in tune you are with your environment, the more efficient you become. So here's an example. My darling wife, who I've been married to for 35 years, she drives looking at maybe 20 meters in front of the car. Her reactions are always stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, because she's reacting short time. So she's reacting to the things that are happening because she's visualizing 20, 30 meters in front of the car. And that means that her response time has to be much faster. I don't drive like that. I drive looking as far down the road as I possibly can, because actually I was taught to drive by a police officer who was a motorway cop, if you like. And his perspective was you always look to the furthest point on the road. And the reason being is because it gives you time to react and slow down and do the things that you do. So which is more efficient? You know, more use of the brake, more use of the accelerator, or actually looking further down the road, allowing that emotional space to be filled and responding accordingly. All the movements are slower, you're going to have less wear and tear on the vehicle because you're not stop, start, brake and acceleration all of the time. You're just, the whole experience becomes easier. So that's my answer to the question, is that the more emotionally engaged that we are, actually, the more we're going to enhance efficiency rather than not.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, I mean, when you described the author mode, I think it also resonated with me in terms of what you mentioned in the book when you talk about the state of flow and how we thrive and get energized in these moments. Can someone learn to be in a state of flow, or how do you know that you are actually in a state of flow? Is there like something that you would recommend as a mini exercise, or?
Well, I think you need to define what the state of flow is. And I would say that for me, being in the state of flow is when I am present. I am in the moment. Everything is working exactly the way that I want it to work. I'm getting the results that I need. I'm happy, I'm motivated, I'm excited. So yeah, being in the state of flow. I mean, if you looked at it from a sports psychology point of view, the state of flow could be the moment when somebody is scoring the goal, or the moment when they're getting the point on the tennis court, or everybody's state of flow is going to be at a different point. In terms of the second part of the question, how do you get into a state of flow? Well, in the book, I talk about the things that I learned from Aikido. And I use four very strict processes. The first one is being centered. That's about making sure that our core is working for us, and our core isn't just the center of our body, it's the center of our entire being. Again, that's explained further in the book. It's also about relaxing. So when we're in the moment, doesn't matter how stressful it is. In fact, if you're in a stressful situation, you cannot be in a state of flow, I don't think. That's my own personal thing. But if you allow yourself to relax, and I'm not talking about just dropping your shoulders and everything. I'm talking about breathing properly. The majority of us actually don't breathe particularly well. We breathe from up here. We take a chest breath. We're putting pressure on our whole physiology as well as our mental process. Whereas if you breathe much lower down around your core, around your center, that's actually going to help you to relax a lot better. The third part I talk about in the book is about being light. And again, that's that feather. That's about lightness of touch. That's about enabling rather than disabling. And the final part of that is about being focused. So, center, relax, light, and focus. And those four words are the things that I use when I want to become more in a state of flow. So prior to this conversation today, I sat here, I had a conversation with Silke and with Christine, and as I was doing that, I was going through mentally and physically center, relax, light, focus. And the focus is about, what do I want? What do I want for you guys to achieve, to get out of this? And it's not, I don't want to sell more books. I want to actually inspire people, to help people, to engage people. And Silke, I know, it wants exactly the same thing. So that's about using it effectively, I think.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's we have Andrea, who actually just also added how she sees the foundation of turning into flow is breathe, think, flow. So it's basically what you were describing with your 4 pillars as well. Now we have a few more really interesting questions. Excited to hear your answers to those. So we have Anthony, and I like that question because there is a study from Stanford that was published last year. It was a study over, I think, 14 years, where they followed MBA graduates in their careers. And systematically, the graduates with a higher EQ on the long term were more successful than with lower EQ. So this just as a context. Now the question from Anthony, in an interview for a leadership role, how do we portray our EI capabilities? It's easy to exhibit IQ capabilities.
Good question. I think that my direct answer is make a connection. Making a connection with another human being and doing it well, that's how you establish your EQ. And being open and being honest and being vulnerable and not showing fear, being confident, you know, that whole confidence is about well, I'm sure that Silke is going to ask me about confidence in a bit anyway, so I'll just leave that for the moment. But it's about being confident and having that, being centered and relaxed and light and focused. And when you exhibit that, actually, your whole presence changes. You know, I spoke at the beginning of this conversation about where this all came from and why I decided to write the book, and it was based on my delivery of a program which was impact and presence. Well, the whole thing is about selling yourself. It's about engaging with other people and how you can create that impact and have that presence to be able to do it. And that is all about demonstrating and using your emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and I think I was like wondering, I know when this person said portraying, actually, for as long as it's part of who you are as a person, I think this is how you will come across. Because if you allow these emotions, if you allow yourself to observe, there is no harm in even saying to the person who interviews you, say, oh, you seem to be worried. What is this about? And suddenly there's a connection because you picked up on something they didn't say. So don't be afraid. Now, I think it was the first question when someone was asking about don't get emotional, right? So this might be a fear that we have, especially when we apply for a new position. It's like we don't want to be perceived as the emotional person. In which case, yes, it's possibly the way we handle these emotions, but bringing them in effectively in a calm way can only contribute to even deeper connections, and people relate to you more easily. Now, there's a question. I love this question from Bogdan. Why are people promoted with EQ and with questionable good intention, selfish careerists versus people with EQ talent?
Of promoted people without EQ and with questionable good intention, selfish careerists.
So I think the question goes in the direction of how come that people who actually have EQ but are not necessarily good people, so why do they get promoted versus other people who have no IQ? Is that the question?
I think that question needs rephrasing, because I think it would be dangerous to answer it without really understanding the context.
Yeah.
So please ask that question again in a way that you want us to answer it, because I think we could slip into a conversation which.
So maybe, the one thing I was thinking of, so while Bogdan wants to reformulate the question, one thing I was thinking of, there's a lot of research from a researcher called Kildoff, which is called the dark side of emotional intelligence. So being an emotionally smart person doesn't necessarily make you a good human being, right? And when you look into leadership, I like to think about leadership as there are different lenses of who you are as a leader. And it's obviously not only your emotional intelligence, it's your values, it's your personality, it's your experiences. So it's like this diamond that has so many facets. And yes, you could be emotionally very smart, but maybe your values drive you in a direction which might harm other people. And you might use the emotional intelligence to manipulate others. Could be. So it's not just one dimension, but there's another question.
Well, sorry, Silke, I actually think that's a good point for us to talk about, because a lot of people say, oh, well, and I think I get the question now, thank you. A lot of people say, well, if it's that strong, if emotional intelligence is that strong, you can use it for bad as well as for good. Well, of course, we can use our intellectual intelligence for bad and for good. You know, we can make bombs as much as we can create processes that heal people. So, you know, it's just human nature. And I think the thing that, you know, if you look at the black side of emotional intelligence, I've heard that that before. I think that's just human nature. I don't think it's anything that, you know, well, if you are extraordinarily high level of emotional intelligence, you know, if you're going to manipulate people, you're going to do that anyway. It doesn't matter whether you have high levels of emotional intelligence or not. In fact, if you've got high levels of emotional intelligence, you will probably come across as being very false if you try to manipulate people. And that's not just to yourself, but you'll end up becoming very false for other people. I've actually come across people who have used a load of stuff, by the way, is the plural of it, just in case you ever wondered. But a lot of people have tried to use stuff to manipulate people, and actually they've used all the right language and all of that. But the thing is, we're not stupid. Human beings, we can see through the rubbish. We know when something's not genuine. We know when someone's lying. So I would say that if your intentions are solid, if your emotions are in the right place, you're using your emotional intelligence for the right reasons, that's when you get great results. If you're doing it for the wrong reasons, well, guess what? You're going to fail, because you won't get great results.
Yeah, which I think is a great reminder that we sort of, if we look at self-awareness, we have to look at so many aspects. And Bogdan just added to the question, and he said, I see that in many companies, not in my company, in many companies, people are promoted who are very nice with superiors and are terrible with the people they control. And good intentions versus hard work people who are good fit. In short, not honest emotions and EQ talent. So basically, yeah, kind of having those emotional skills, but not being honest.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference between appeasing the behaviors of the management, the senior leadership, and being nice and lovely with them, and being downright horrible to the people that you're managing. That's not emotional intelligence. That's just great acting. You know, the being for what to get people to like you. That's just a show, because it's you can act, you can pretend that you agree with somebody when perhaps you don't, just because you want them to like you. But the reality is, it's how you behave. It's that whole thing about being, isn't it? You know, if you're trying to do emotional intelligence, you're going to fail.
Yeah.
If you're actually being emotionally intelligent, you will always win.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, you know, I mean, looking at your assessment where you actually have 14 skills, right? And you see underneath each, there's sort of 3 subskills. So it's very likely that there is a person who is not necessarily the high flyer on all of these. Now, it could be with a profile like the one you described, Bogdan, that I would see someone who has a lot of self-empathy, who connects with his or her own needs really, really well, but maybe doesn't connect so much with the needs of other people, in which case it's very easy to sort of manage my superior and not care about the people around because I'm lacking that skill. So that's possible. Now we have more questions coming. I love this, actually. So John, we have, yeah. So, oh, no, there's no question from, earlier, yeah. So a question from John, if I'm following properly, it does appear that with emotional intelligence, one has to lead from the inside out rather than outside in. Beautiful.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100% spot on. You've got to get you right first of all. You have to work on you before you can then make sure that you're working on everybody else. No, go there first. First rule of leadership, first rule of emotional leadership, go there first.
Yeah. Excellent. So here we have a question from Daniel, and Daniel, write in the chat if it's not the right interpretation of your question. So Daniel asks, how do you relate emotional intelligence with depression?
Ooh, okay. The majority of depression can be brought around, not saying is or will be, but a lot of depression can be brought around through negative self-talk. So the sheer context of us sitting down and saying, I can't do that, I'm not good at that, I'm always rubbish at that. It's that inner dialogue that we have that drives, in a lot of people's cases, that case of depression. And it's a human thing. Almost every human being out there, doesn't matter what country you're in, what culture you're in, where you're from, we all have that inner dialogue. Now, highly emotionally intelligent people are the ones that challenge their own inner dialogue. So if you're having a conversation which is saying to you, I'm rubbish, I can't do this, look how bad I am, the other part, the emotionally intelligent part of your brain should be going, well, why not? Why can't you do that? You're just as capable as anybody else. Why should you keep having these negative conversations with yourself when you don't need to? What can you be doing differently? How can you adjust that? The other part of your emotionally intelligent brain could be the one that's accepting, that's going, yes, we're all rubbish. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to fail. And actually, there's a lot of work which has been done and will continue to be done around how that whole negative process that we all have can work against us, and importantly, it can work for us as well. Because when I notice, for example, that I'm going into a negative dialogue, I will then challenge myself with positive dialogue, and I will turn that around. And it takes a while. It doesn't happen overnight. I don't believe that, I'm the most intelligent, or certainly not the most emotionally intelligent person in the world. And I've written a book about it. In fact, I'm still learning. And I think that the mere fact that I'm putting my hand up saying, actually, I am still learning, is the fact that I am becoming more emotionally intelligent, because I would never have said that a good few years ago. And by the way, a good few years ago, I probably had more depression than I would have nowadays because of life situation and me constantly thinking that I wasn't good enough, which happens. When I was growing up, I was one of those people who go, well, I can't do this, I can't do that, I won't do this, I'm not good enough. And yet other people were telling me how wonderful I was, but I didn't believe them, and I didn't believe in myself. And that, that's the same. And it doesn't make us any less human to be admitting those things. In fact, I'm very comfortable talking about those things. Hopefully that helps with that question.
Yeah, now I think it was really helpful that you went into the direction of what we also call thinking traps or self-limiting beliefs. So if this is an issue for someone, that might be the area you want to research on and sort of read about. What is it that we do to ourselves to limit and maybe go into the direction of depression? And also in clinical psychology, you measure emotional intelligence with slightly different tools, but there you can, for example, identify if someone actually does have the skills, but might have what we call a cognitive bias. So in these clinical tests, you can identify if someone actually only sees the negative expressions. So this is something you could then work on from a clinical perspective if it's a clinical depression. So this is just as a side comment. No, more questions. So here we have a question from Renee. Have you observed an evolution of emotional intelligence from the management era of traditionalists to baby boomers to Gen Xers to Gen Y millennials? Excellent question.
I think that what has made the biggest shift in how emotional intelligence works is our ability to communicate. So I've noticed a significant shift in the last 2 years because more and more people are having virtual meetings. They're meeting globally. You know, we've got hundreds of people from all over the planet actually on this call, and that's changed. That was never available 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. And if it was, very few people were using it. So how we're interacting, how we're working with technology has changed. I also noticed that with my children, I have 3 who are all in their late teens, early 30s. You know, their world is very different because their world is all about you know, using technology in a way that we didn't when we were growing up. So they may be having 1 or 2 or 3 different conversations with people at the same time on mobile phones, and while they're also talking with somebody in a room. So their use of emotional intelligence is different. So I think it's quite a hard question to answer. And I think in terms of generationally, I think yes, things have eased up. Things are becoming a lot easier. You know, the communication I have, for example, with my children is very different to the type of communication that my parents had with their parents, because of how, you know, we just communicate globally in a different way now. So technology's played a part. I also think that you know, television, movies, all of those things have enabled us to become much more emotionally aware, I think is the word. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Silke.
I think they're emotionally more aware. Now, I think it's possibly the responsibility of the baby boomers or the generations above, for the millennials, to actually give them the right tools. So they might have different challenges because given that they are far more exposed and sort of emotions are amplified for the millennials, they try to solve these emotional conflicts and issues through technology, and this is just not going to work. I mean, you cannot escalate a conversation through a WhatsApp conversation, and that's what this generation sometimes does. So I think they need to get different tools in order to say, well, there are stuff that you actually do have to address with another human being in the room. You cannot sort of handle something that's emotionally very strong through a WhatsApp chat. So I think there's definitely a challenge for them in the future. So we have a few more questions. So is politics really necessary at companies at high level? I realize that most people involved in politics seem to have zero emotional intelligence.
I think that's a I don't think that's just a company thing. I think that's probably a global thing. I love that. Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question purely because I think it would be very political of me not to. I think that the point is that a lot of people are elected because, or into roles in organizations because they have the right skills, the right knowledge, the right capability, and the majority of people are recruited based on what they've done before. What they're not judged on in any way nearly effectively enough is what they are potentially capable of doing in the future. So, you know, if someone does a good job, they get promoted. They reach the point of their own capability because they've been promoted perhaps into a role that needs a lot more emotional intelligence, or they need to stop doing and start being a leader and managing and engaging and everything else. It's a huge question, and I think we could spend hours going into the reasons why leadership tend to be less emotional intelligent in some organization and politically as well. And I think again that goes back to the whole purpose of it depends on what people's intention is. If people's intention is purely about making money, their focus is going to be there. Whereas if their intention is allowing more people in an organization to make more money, then their focus is going to be a lot wider than just the organization making more money. The organizations that become more successful are the ones who have leadership, who make it successful for everybody rather than the few. So that's how I'd leave that question.
Yeah, there's another question from Adrian, which I really love, because working also with teenagers, it's a beautiful question. Why do you believe there's an increase of depression in teenagers if parents try to educate them emotional intelligence? Do you think technology made them less smart?
Less smart emotionally or less smart intellectually?
I think what Adrian means is like less smart in terms of the emotional intelligence, because they are so much exposed to technology. Oh, he says both.
Well, my experience is that actually the technology is enabling them to make different connections. I think what I've perhaps witnessed is that a lot of teenagers who are naturally going to be isolated because they have much more, they're more on the IQ side than they are on the EI side. They are still going to be isolated, and technology will isolate them even further. Whereas outgoing, gregarious, people-pleasing children, teenagers will use technology to expand their relationships and their circle of influence. So I think it does depend very much on the individual and what technology will do. It's just another tool. It will either exasperate it or it will reduce it, depending on the individual.
Yeah, and before we take the last question here, which is from Bogdan, I just want to let you know that you can contact either Phil or myself with any question that might be coming even afterwards. So last question here from Bogdan: is the weak point of many leadership assessment is that they are self-assessments? Maybe we think wrong about our talents, capabilities, intentions. What could be another way to assess a state of organizational leadership other than self-assessments?
Well, I mean, I think the mere fact that it's a self-assessment is probably what causes the problem. I think if we are measuring people based on their leadership capability, and if their leadership capability included some form of emotional intelligence assessment, which leads us nicely back to the book, by the way, I think people would have a better understanding of who they are and what they could be offering and growing. I think the problem with assessments, though, is that it's about how things are right now. It doesn't necessarily assess how things are likely to be in the future. So if you're going to use an assessment to assess leadership capability, it needs to be something which is done on a regular basis. It's not, as you've already pointed out in your question, self-assessment. It can be more something which is done online, or it's done in a way that the questions ask you in a way that it doesn't become driven just by your thinking. In other words, maybe 360, or you're using other people's answers as well.
Yeah, and it's always an entry point for conversation. Even if it's a self-assessment, it's an entry point for conversation, and you might know best which are the situations in which you struggle the most or in which you thrive the most, and then relate it to these skills. I mean, I could go on for hours to discuss with you, the audience, and of course, Phil. I mean, it was very generous of you to spend this hour with us and sharing your wisdom and answering the question of the audience. And as I said, feel free to reach out to us any moment in time. I believe you have our emails. And if you don't have our emails, then I can give you mine, which is simply silke.mischke@imd.org. And if you want Phil's email, then I would simply share it with you.
Yeah, and just to say, mine is simply phil@philipholder, all one word, .co.uk. And no problem at all.
Excellent. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Those in Malaysia, I think it's time to have dinner now.
Absolutely. And thank you everybody for your questions. Really interesting session.
Yeah,
Thank you so
brilliant.
much.